Welcome everyone to Pirate Vibes on the Big East Network. We got a special guest today, and we're going to dive deep into the issues at Seton Hall. We're going to bring him on. It's Patrick Madden from the Big East blog. He's one of the guys you got to follow. If you're a Seton Hall guy, especially on Twitter, he's going to comment. He's going to find all the Seton Hall content, and he's going to leave you a comment. That's how we met. I started the show, and he started reaching out, giving me feedback about the show. Patrick, how are you?
Bryan, nice to be on. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. So I wanted to bring you on because I think you're very passionate about the program. Obviously, you write for the Big East blog. You want to talk about your work before we dig into Seton Hall because that could take all the time, and then we're not going to be talking about your work. So go ahead.
Well, we'll be quick. I'm an
Okay.
alum class of 1995. I've been a fan since the Final Four in 1989, maybe even a little bit before that. 6 seasons ago, I started the Big East blog, in part so I could comment not only about Seton Hall, but everybody in the Big East. It gives me an idea to make a comparison between where the Pirates are and, let's say, where Connecticut is, or St. John's is, or every other school in the Big East. So I try to print articles, weekly, in the maybe a couple of times a month in the off season now. But when the season starts, I give rankings. I give some game previews, and I give some player profiles that I write during the season.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So you went to school there. You went to school at Seton Hall. I became a fan about the same time. I'm not trying to date you or anything. But who was your favorite player when you first became a fan? I got to know that before we start. Dig
I
deep.
think I think the first guy was Mark Bryant,
Okay. Awesome.
class of '88. Still, he's an assistant coach with Knicks.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, I think he was the guy who helped propel Seton Hall from a bad spot where they were 40 years ago to they made their first NCAA tournament in 1988, and of course the next year was the Final Four year. Guys like Raymond Ramos, John Morton, Gerald Green, and then the list goes on.
Awesome. So I became, like I said, I became a fan about the same exact time. One of my guys was Terry DeHare. Obviously, it's everybody's guy. And then, ironically, Dan Hurley. I was a big fan of Danny Hurley because he wasn't Bobby at the time. And we're going to start there. The big news over the past week and a half was that Tom Moore became the general manager at UConn. So a general manager. We're just going to use that term. We'll dig deeper in a second. I want to know your take. We're going to start it right off the bat. Is Seton Hall missing that position right there? Does Shaheen need more help when it comes to the roster management part of the build side?
A lot of people would say yes. I don't know. That's sort of, you got to think about how Shaheen Holloway does things. He keeps things very close. He has a very close inner circle. He's had the same three assistants for I think the last 3 seasons. And then this off season he brought in a guy, Andrew Francis, who was a longtime assistant to Fran McCaffrey, first at Siena and then at Iowa. And he did a lot of the player personnel stuff. He did a lot of recruiting out at Iowa. So I think it was Holloway's idea that he was going to bring this outside guy in whose pure focus was going to be doing outside player analysis for purposes of who do we want to recruit, and then in part who do we want to look at in the transfer portal. I think the role, see a lot of these quote unquote GMs, including to a certain extent more, are really assistant coaches who are given that title to sort of, highlight the fact that they have that role. It's sort of the role of player personnel, player management, so on and so forth. So I think that's really what Andrew Francis's role is. It doesn't get a lot of attention, probably because Holloway and people around Seton Hall haven't really talked Francis up that much, which of course is one of the sort of one of the faults in how Holloway does things, because he doesn't really let you see how he's doing things, how he organizes the program, and so on and so forth. I think if he put Andrew Francis out there more often, there would be less chatter about, well, who's in charge of making all these portal acquisitions.
Yeah. So you talk about Shaheen with being close to the vest. Do you think that works in this market? Do you long term? Do you think that will work, especially in this NIL era? Do you think him being very quiet and kind of close, not out there in the press in this kind of era? I know the era has changed a lot, especially since you started watching college basketball and myself. Does this work anymore? Like you cannot be a Bill Belichick in the NIL era, and a Patriot Belichick, I will say. Let's.
I I think if you win, you
It doesn't
can
matter.
handle things however you want.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, I mean, the problem, you have the last two seasons, which are sort of night and day.
Yep.
2 years ago, he wins 25 games. He wins the NIT. And at that point, even though there's been misgivings about NIL from the jump at Seton Hall, he can sort of go out there and say, I can win in the NIL era, even if I don't have the resources of other schools in the Big East and nationally. But then you get the last season and he wins 7 games, and now everybody questions everything. Why doesn't he talk to the press more often? Why isn't he sending more tweets out talking about how he's doing things, how he operates? Why is the only thing we get from him in terms of his social media the occasional Bible quote?
Yep.
So that's probably part of the problem with Holloway, is that he doesn't really open himself up. And even the people who are supposed to be covering Seton Hall don't think that they get the full story from Holloway, even though, let's say they call him, they text him, they show up at practices. But even them, even the guys who are supposed to be telling you what's going on, in terms of the people, in terms of the handful of people who cover the program on a regular basis, don't seem to know the whole story about what's going on. And, again, if you win, you can do things however you want. If you lose, then, once in a while, maybe you should be trying to explain yourself more. Because, then you run into the issue of, how many people are going to renew season tickets? How many people are going to give to your NIL if they don't really know what's going on, or they think it's a waste of money, particularly if you put up another subpar season like they just came off of.
So repairing our image with the subharps season, this new roster. You talk about how the coaching staff, Andrew Francis. How do you take how the roster is being built this year? Because obviously it's a complete turnover outside of a handful of guys, 3 guys. It's a brand new roster. Do you think there's a significant upgrade on the guys that they're bringing in?
It's unfortunately too early to tell,
Yep.
because there are still 5 roster spots put out there, and we don't know what direction. We sort of know what the holes are in this roster right now,
Yep.
but we don't know where Holloway's going to go to fill them. For example, last year he picks up Garway Dual from
Yep.
Providence in the first week of June. And the question became, yeah, look, what's he doing bringing Dual? And we know that Dual was a very highly rated guy. We know he had Big East experience. But then what did that mean to guys like Chauncey Jenkins, Zion Harmon, Scotty
Yep.
Middleton, Isaiah Coleman? Where did their roles, how did their roles change, because he had to find a spot in the roster, or a spot in the rotation for Dual. So it really depends on who else he picks up going forward, to sort of figure out what roles guys like Simpkins and Dar
Yep.
and McCray and some of the guys he's already picked up in the portal. We won't know that until he fills a roster out, and hopefully that's going to happen sometime for the next few weeks.
Yeah, definitely. So if we do bring in a general manager, or let's dive into that first before we go to commercial break. What can we call it instead of a general manager? I think a general manager is a completely terrible title, because every time we say general manager, we're thinking, the guy that running the personnel and then the coach. While the general manager kind of controls the coach, he's kind of over the coach. In this situation, it's kind of the other way around. The coach would kind of be ahead of the general manager. So first of all, what would we be able to call it, and what kind of guy do you think we should have at Seton Hall?
I mean, honestly, from what I read about Francis, I think Francis fits the role. Francis could fit that role very nicely, given his years of experience, working with Fran McCaffrey. I mean, they had good talent first at Siena, uh, where he worked with McCaffrey, I think 15 years ago, and then he got some pretty good talent at Iowa. So if he's got the ability to put that type of talent on a roster at Seton Hall, I mean, I'd love to see the types of teams, because those Iowa teams that McCaffrey had, they were ranked most of the time. They made the tournament all the time. So I mean, if Francis can take what he learned under McCaffrey at Iowa and bring it to the Seton Hall coaching staff, I think that they're not going to have 7-25 seasons anymore. I would hope that we can start making NCAA tournaments on a regular basis if you can bring a guy with that type of eye for talent, and they fit what Seton Hall needs.
So if we kind of shift him to that kind of general manager role, the the school needs to support another position, right? Would we agree that he has to bring on another guy, because this guy's going to have a full time role of having, control the NIL, the transfer portal, the recruiting, all that kind of stuff, the roster management stuff? Would you say that the school has to kind of open up their pocketbook and bring on another coach?
Uh, They may need to do it for a different reason.
Okay.
I do think that people who criticize, and this is nothing against guys like Ryan Whalen. Ryan Whalen's going to be there until he gets his own head coaching job, because he and Holloway have been together for the better part of 10 years now.
Yeah.
The one I think that there is, I do think that spending more money to get, let's say, more experienced assistant coaches, and assistant coaches who have been on successful rosters at different places. I think that's really what I think they have a sufficient number of guys, because you got to keep in mind, that the one thing which has changed in the NIL era, and you can notice this when you hear Rick Pitino speak. You can notice this with some of the other coaches, is that there is less emphasis on high school recruiting.
Yep.
Usually, you would have these guys go out and sit on 10 or 15 guys who you're trying to pick up from the high school ranks. Coaches just don't do that as much, so I think they have more time. The current staff has more time to work on these transfers and work on getting this, using the resources with the NIL. So I don't think you need an additional person in there. I think if Seton Hall is going to make an investment, it's going to make an investment to sort of upgrade the current coaching staff, and maybe bring somebody in who's got a different skill set than of the coaches that they currently have.
That's awesome. So right after the break, me and Patrick are going to talk about maybe who we can bring in to upgrade the staff. This is Pirate Vibes. Welcome back to Pirate Vibes. I'm joined by Patrick Madden of the Big East blog. We talked about the GM and that role and expanding the staff, changing the staff. We both kind of had different takes. I want to know who you would bring on to help Shaheen Holloway kind of take that next step, because obviously you talked about in the previous, we had two different seasons in his first two seasons, right? It was like the NIT, and then obviously last year's debacle. Where would you take this staff for the next step? Because obviously something's got to change. Maybe it is changing with the roster overhaul, but it seems like something's off at Seton Hall.
Yeah, I'm going to give you three names of
Okay.
guys. Uh,
Three names. We only talked about two off,
I know,
so
I know, I know.
you're
I
throwing me
thought of
for a trick.
one. I thought of
Awesome.
one at the last minute, so I'm going to throw an audible here.
Awesome. All right.
The guy who is rumored to be brought on, I think it was sometime last year, and for whatever reason they probably couldn't get the money to work out. Is uh, Seton Hall legend Andre Barrett.
Yeah.
Good old number 12. He was number 12 because they unretired Richie Regan's number, and gave it to Barrett, because that's how highly they thought of Barrett. And of course, Barrett led the team into the NCAA tournament in 2004 and 2006. He works. I think he works for the Philadelphia 76ers. Don't quote me on that, but that's the problem. He had an NBA scouting job, and for some reason, he Holloway couldn't give Barrett the incentive to get him to sign on. A guy I think who's got potential in the not too distant future to be a guy he might bring in is a guy who played for Holloway for 4 seasons, three of them at St. Peter's and one of them at Seton Hall, is Casey Nadefo. He's playing professionally in Greece right now. He got his degree actually in sports management. And I think if there's the one thing about Holloway, and we talked about this in the first segment, is that Holloway really, the people he brings in and people who work with him are people he trusts. And he basically was the guy, Nadefo was basically his ride or die for the 3 or 4 years he was at St. Peter's, and then was the guy he leaned upon most heavily in his first season at Seton Hall coach 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Nadefo's playing professionally in Greece. I don't know how much longer he's going to keep with his career. He's the type of guy maybe you bring in as a director of basketball operations when he decides to retire from professional basketball, with the idea maybe in a year or two after that, he could be a member of the staff full time. The third guy, and this would take a couple of things to happen, and it's sort of a wild card, would be NJIT coach Grant Billemeyer.
Wow.
They worked together under Kevin Willard back in the day. I mean, this would sort of require, Billemeyer hasn't gotten off to a great start at NJIT. I think he's won a combined 10 or 11 games in 2 seasons there. Now, granted, he had to start, basically from the ground floor at NJIT, but, depending on how long he decides to hang on there. Now, the problem with Billemeyer is that Billemeyer, did such a great job as assistant coach, first at Seton Hall and then at Maryland under Kevin Willard, that he would probably, if he hit the market as an assistant coach, he'd probably have some pretty nice offers out there because he's seen as a big man whisperer, a guy you can take, a guy like he basically made Romaro Gill 5 years ago, somebody who had barely touched a basketball 2 or 3 years before he went to college, and made him one of the best defensive big men in the Big East. So in that sense, Bill is sort of like a wild card. Would he sort of go back to where he was before? Might he need to go back to a place like Seton Hall to rebuild his coaching reputation? I don't know. But I think the key to getting somebody on staff is somebody who can sort of some upgrade the coaching, upgrade the recruiting a little bit, and be somebody who sort of gives the staff more credibility than the staff that they currently have.
So you would definitely lean towards a younger guy, a hungrier guy, than someone that maybe is on the back nine. That like a Tom Moore at UConn, you would favor someone that they can grow here at Seton Hall and then probably move on.
Yeah, I
Then
think the idea of an older coach, and then we talked about this in the
yeah,
break, was if he's going to bring on an older guy, it'd be someone who he'd have to know, someone who maybe he worked with, who was one of his coaches at Seton Hall. Like I'll throw a name out there of someone who would never do it, but might fit that mold, and that's Chris Collins. Obviously, he's probably not going to leave Northwestern for a long time.
yeah.
But Chris Collins is a guy who he worked with at Seton Hall. Collins was an assistant under Collins was an assistant when Seton Hall made the Sweet 16 in 2000 under Tommy Amaker. So that's the type of guy I think who, if you're talking about older guy who's maybe looking to back off from a head coaching job, that would be the type of guy I would look at in term, because that's someone who Holloway knows, Holloway trusts, somebody who's not going to try to upstage him, which is something I think that's something which Holloway wants everyone to make sure, even though he's not the most vocal leader, he wants to make sure that somebody doesn't go up there who's going to upstage him. And I think that's someone who, if he went to a Chris Collins, or let's say even a Tommy Amaker, he'd have to tell him, your role isn't as assistant coach. Basically at this point, I'm the guy in charge. I lean on you because you have decades of experience coaching. You can tell me things that I'm missing. But basically at this point, I'm in charge. You're an assistant coach. You're not going to use this as an opportunity, to upstage me or to undermine me to get yourself, whatever you want.
So you really think that is a driving motivation for Shah through a lot of his decision making. Is
Oh,
that
absolutely. I think
that
this is
he's in charge, and even though he's quiet and he's not boastful and like he's out there, I'm in charge. But you think behind closed doors he's in charge, and it's definite.
Oh, absolutely. I definitely think that he tries to run as tight a ship as possible. I remember one of the things that one of the leading commentators about Seton Hall, South Orange Juice, one of the leading Twitter, one of the leading Twitter followers of the
Yeah,
Seton Hall
yeah,
program has
yeah, big
said
guy.
is that the one thing, for good or for bad, that does not happen at Seton Hall in terms of how they're recruiting are leaks.
Yeah,
You don't hear a lot about what's going on, and there are situations where guys are being recruited in the portal that we don't hear about until you know we don't hear about until we see those announcements, from Twitter, and even it's not from Holloway himself. Somebody else says
yeah,
Mr. Joe Smith has transferred from Arizona State to Seton Hall, and we don't
yeah.
hear about it until it actually happens.
Yeah,
So
I think until the last two, I think it's been that case from Bud Clark all the way down to Payne and Dar. Basically, there was no. You talk about South Orange Juice, how he keeps track of all the contacts and all that, and none of those guys were on the list. And it's like, so you're looking at my list, you're actually crossing off guys for me, and I just got to figure out the rest.
right.
Yeah. Um, what's the biggest opportunity for Seton Hall going forward? Like, what is to get Seton Hall back to where it needs to be? And I know it's only 2 years away from the NIT championship, so it's not like we're at this dead era of a decade of being terrible. We're not DePaul, right? Like we had a terrible year last year.
Or Georgetown, for that matter.
Yeah, or Georgetown, exactly. We're not them. We're not even Nova, who kind of has been struggling since Wright left. Um, what's their biggest opportunity to at least get to be respectable in the Big East on a consistent basis? That
I
that's
like
that, that's what I think all Seton Hall fans want. I know we expect championships and all that kind of stuff and bring back the glory days, and we would love that. But man, I just don't want to live with a 7-win season every 2 years.
I think that it's a matter of getting the revenue sharing right,
Yeah,
and part of it is that you've got to basically tap into people who are either alumni or people who are close to the program, who, for whatever, you've got to sell them on being a bigger part. Now, the good news is that there are a handful of donors who are willing to write six-figure. The one guy in particular, Al Frangilio, who basically runs the cafeteria at Seton Hall. He's written $1 million checks to the NIL. Unfortunately, he's not Mike Repoli, who's writing $10 million checks at St. John's.
yeah,
But I think they got to find creative ways to, you know, use their revenue, creative ways to raise some other NIL on the side. You talked about this in your first episode. And then I think they've got to be able to use the resources properly. A lot of people mock the way Marquette does things, for example.
yeah,
That Marquette basically relies almost exclusively on recruiting. Marquette has expectations that guys are going to be with the program for 3 or 4 years. But what it does is it builds continuity. It builds this idea that you're preparing for the future every year. Guys who are freshmen get more minutes when they're sophomores, and then they get more minutes when they're juniors. A lot of people don't know how well the Marquette system works, except I'll tell you they've won 98 games the last 4 years.
yeah,
Uh, Shaka Smart's going to win 20 games a year, period. End of discussion. Every year he's at Marquette because he builds on continuity. He doesn't need the best talent in the world. I don't know. Yeah, they have some NIL. I don't think it's at a St. John's level or even a Connecticut level, but he uses his money wisely and he builds up. And I think that's sort of something where, that might be easier said than done at Seton Hall because I don't think we have Marquette's money. But I think if you find the right guys who are willing to buy into the program over a year basis, and you give them the incentive to stay around for 2 or 3 years, then you, like, for example, the NIT team, their three most important players, Kadari Richmond, Dre Davis, and Alamir Dawes, were all playing their second year
Yeah.
under Shaheen Holloway. It was continuity. They learned the system, and then obviously they went from 17 wins the first season under Holloway to 25 wins in an NIT title the second year. So I think that's something which Seton Hall should be thinking about, whether it's Holloway or whether it's whoever, depending on how things go the next season or two.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Patrick. I'm gonna try to convince you to come on here more to drop some knowledge, some Seton Hall knowledge, some Jersey knowledge on the Big East Energy Network. Tell everyone where they can find you on Twitter or your website for the blog.
I'm on Twitter at the Sports JD. I think most of I think we probably have a lot of common followers at this point.
Yep.
So the Sports JD is my Twitter handle. You can go to the Big East blog .com. I usually will link my articles. I obviously I try to give everyone the Big East equal play under the blog, and I try not to tell people on the blog. Obviously, if you follow me on Twitter and you read the blog, you know I'm a Seton Hall fan.
Yeah.
But I try to be up the middle. I try to provide the objective analysis when I'm writing a Seton Hall article. Uh, I think that there are sometimes, mostly in my Twitter, but in some other places, where I'll put my heart in my sleeve about how things are going at Seton Hall. I think I appreciate the opportunity to get to speak to a couple of the things I think they need to be doing. So on and so forth. I hope in the future, when we take a look at how things are going, how the roster ends up, how the schedule runs up, and then how, let's say, the first few weeks of the season, I can tell you if we're moving back in the right direction, or I'll throw a hot take out there. 7-25 means Shaheen Holloway is not the Seton Hall coach at this time next year.
Oh, 100%, 100%. They have to be considerably better, I believe, because otherwise you're not going to be able to fundraise anything, and the NIL, you're even further behind the eight ball. If you cannot do two back to, in a power conference, you cannot do two back, otherwise you become DePaul. And I know I keep saying that, but like Seton Hall should not be at DePaul right now. Like they should not, and that's just my clear expectation for this program. But I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to bring you back on. I know I am. I can already tell. I just got to convince you to stay up till 9 p.m. and record this with me, and we'll be good to go.
No problem, Bryan. Anytime.
All right. This has been Pirate Vibes. Stay true, stay blue. Vibe on.
Ahoy there!